Gas cost less than 60 cents a gallon. Every kid on the block was collecting bicentennial quarters, and the only way to change the channel was to walk across the room. That was 1976. Number 85 on this countdown covers the movie that turned a struggling actor and a script written on legal pads into the biggest hit of the year. Number 43 sent the government door to door with a vaccination campaign that fell apart before winter. And number 17 put a machine on the surface of Mars and sent back a photograph that changed how a generation understood the night sky. Now, hit subscribe, because here are 100 moments, objects, and memories from 1976 that show what life in America really looked like. Number 100. The $2 bill. On April 13, 1976, the United States Treasury reissued the $2 bill for the first time in a decade. It came back with a new face on the reverse, a reproduction of John Trumbull's painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Banks received shipments that morning and lines formed at teller windows across the country. People wanted one not because they needed $2, but because they wanted to hold something that felt historic. Some took them straight home and pressed them into books. Others rubber-stamped them with the date and their zip code. Coin collectors sealed them in plastic sleeves. The Postal Service sold 13-cent stamps just so people could get a canceled postmark on a bill. Within a few weeks, the excitement cooled. Cashiers confused them with ones. Vending machines rejected them. Register drawers had no slot for them. Most people stopped spending them, which meant most people stopped seeing them. The $2 bill never went away, but it never quite came back either. Number 99. The tall ships at Operation Sail. On July 4, 1976, a fleet of tall ships from more than 30 nations sailed into New York Harbor under full canvas. Operation Sail brought square-rigged vessels and barks that looked like they belonged in another century past the Statue of Liberty. While millions of people crowded the shoreline, rooftops, and fire escapes of Lower Manhattan. The Coast Guard cutters sprayed red, white, and blue arcs of water into the harbor. Tugboats sounded their horns in unison. Helicopters hovered overhead, and every television camera in the city pointed toward the water. Some of the ships had crossed the Atlantic just for the occasion, their sails patched and their rigging taut against the summer wind. It was the single most watched event of the bicentennial summer. Families drove hours for a glimpse. Some never saw a sail clearly through the crowd but said the day was worth it anyway. The harbor had not looked like that since the age of clipper ships, and it never would again. Number 98. The National Air and Space Museum. On July 1, 1976, 3 days before the bicentennial, the Smithsonian opened the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall in Washington. The Wright Flyer hung from the ceiling. Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis was suspended nearby. A lunar module stood behind glass, and visitors could touch an actual piece of moon rock brought back by the Apollo astronauts. The building drew 1 million visitors in its first month. Families lined up before sunrise in the summer heat. Kids pressed their foreheads against glass cases and stared at capsules that had actually orbited the Earth. Fathers who remembered watching the moon landing on television stood under the real spacecraft and said nothing for a long time. Within a year, the museum became the most visited in the world, and for a generation of children, it was the reason the family took the long drive to Washington. Number 97. Legionnaire's disease. In late July of 1976, more than 2,000 American Legion members gathered at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia for their annual convention. It was a grand old hotel, the kind with chandeliers in the lobby and doormen in uniform. Within days of returning to their homes in towns across Pennsylvania and beyond, dozens of attendees fell ill with a severe pneumonia that their doctors could not explain. By the end of August, the number of sick had climbed past 200. More than 24 died. Newspapers ran the story on front pages for weeks. The Bellevue Stratford emptied. Conventions canceled. Health officials descended on the building, testing the water supply, the air ducts, the kitchen, and every surface they could reach with a swab. The investigation ground on for months before a team at the Centers for Disease Control finally identified a previously unknown bacterium thriving in the hotel's cooling tower. The name they gave it, Legionella, stuck. The disease rattled the country not because of the body count alone, but because for an entire stretch of that summer, no one in medicine could say what was causing it, and the silence from the experts was louder than the headlines. Number 96. The AMC Pacer. American Motors introduced the Pacer in 1975, but 1976 was the year it became unavoidable on the road. The car was wider than it was long, wrapped almost entirely in glass, and shaped like nothing else in any parking lot in the country. Dealers promoted it as the first wide small car. Buyers were curious, and it sold reasonably well that year, helped by the fuel economy pitch and the fact that it simply looked like a visitor from another automotive planet. The passenger side door was longer than the driver's side to make getting into the back seat easier, a detail most people never noticed. The greenhouse of windows made it an oven in summer and a fishbowl in traffic. By 1978, interest had faded sharply, but in 1976, the Pacer was everywhere, and people either loved it or stood in the parking lot and stared. Number 95. The Betamax VCR. Sony's Betamax video cassette recorder reached American stores in late 1975, but 1976 was the first full year a family could walk into an electronics department and buy a machine that recorded television programs onto magnetic tape. The price was steep, well over $1,000 at most retailers, and the tapes were not cheap either. Early adopters set timers to capture episodes they would miss during work. Others stacked tapes of movies recorded off late-night broadcasts and built libraries on their shelves. The picture quality was sharper than anything that came after it, and the tapes were compact and neat. Nobody knew, yet that JVC was about to release a competing format called VHS that would eventually win the war. In 1976, Betamax was the future of home entertainment, sitting on a shelf next to the television, quietly blinking its clock. Number 94. Taxi Driver. Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver opened in February 1976 and left audiences unsettled in a way that most films released that year did not attempt. Robert De Niro played Travis Bickle, a lonely Vietnam veteran driving the night shift through a New York City that looked like it was rotting from the inside out. The streets were wet and neon lit. The passengers were desperate or dangerous or both. The violence, when it arrived, was sudden and graphic. The ending was ambiguous. Critics debated whether the film condemned or glorified its protagonist, and the argument never really settled. Jodie Foster, barely a teenager, played a role that drew controversy and an Academy Award nomination. Taxi Driver became one of the defining American films of the decade, and its vision of a city collapsing under its own decay was something audiences in 1976 recognized, even if they did not want to admit it. Number 93. All the President's Men. In April 1976, a film about two newspaper reporters opened in theaters and became one of the biggest hits of the spring. Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman played Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the Washington Post journalists who helped uncover the Watergate scandal that brought down Richard Nixon's presidency barely 2 years earlier. The story was still raw. Nixon had resigned in August 1974. Gerald Ford's pardon was still controversial. Half the country felt the system had worked, and the other half felt it had been rigged from the start. The film turned a newsroom into a thriller set. Redford insisted on recreating the actual Post newsroom down to the contents of the trash cans. The dialogue moved fast. The tension built through phone calls and parking garage meetings, and the audience already knew the ending but watched anyway because the process was the point. All the President's Men did something unusual for a political film. It made journalism look exciting. Enrollment in journalism schools rose measurably in the years that followed. Young people who watched Redford chase a lead on screen showed up at college newspaper offices the next semester. In 1976, the idea that two people with notebooks and persistence could hold a president accountable was not just a memory, it was still a live wire. Number 92. The Muppet Show. Jim Henson had been pitching a Muppet variety show aimed at adults for years before it finally landed on television in 1976. No American network picked it up, so it was produced in London for Associated Television and syndicated across the United States. Kermit the Frog hosted from backstage. Miss Piggy stole scenes with karate chops and unrequited devotion. Statler and Waldorf heckled from the balcony. Fozzie Bear told jokes that deserved the heckling. Guest stars ranged from opera singers to rock bands, and most of them seemed slightly bewildered by the chaos around them. The Muppet Show became one of the most watched programs in the world within its first season, airing in over 100 countries. For families in 1976, it was one of the few shows the whole house could sit through without anyone arguing over the dial. Number 91. Laverne and Shirley. The show premiered in January 1976 as a spin-off of Happy Days and became a hit almost instantly. Penny Marshall and Cindy Williams played two brewery workers in 1950s Milwaukee who shared a basement apartment and got into trouble on a weekly basis. The humor was broad and physical. Laverne drank milk and Pepsi mixed together. Shirley clutched a stuffed cat named Boo Boo Kitty. Their upstairs neighbors, Lenny and Squiggy, entered every scene with the same greeting and the same bad timing. Within weeks, the show was drawing audiences larger than the show that had spawned it. By the end of its first season, Laverne and Shirley was the #1 program in the country. In a year of serious films and political uncertainty, a sitcom about two working-class women tripping over furniture became the thing America most wanted to watch. Number 90. Network. Sidney Lumet's network opened in November 1976 and introduced a line that entered the language before the credits rolled. Peter Finch played Howard Beale, a veteran news anchor who had a breakdown on the air, leaned into the camera, and told viewers to go to their windows and shout that they were mad as hell and were not going to take it anymore. Audiences in theaters laughed, then they stopped laughing. The film was a satire of television news that played like prophecy. It predicted the merger of entertainment and journalism, the rise of ratings-driven outrage, and the moment when the personality behind the desk mattered more than the story being reported. Faye Dunaway played a programming executive who treated human suffering as content. In 1976, network was considered exaggeration. Within a generation, it looked more like a documentary. Number 89. The Bicentennial Freedom Train. Starting in 1975 and running through the end of 1976, a red, white, and blue locomotive pulled a train of exhibition cars across the country, stopping in more than 80 cities along the way. Inside the display cars were artifacts from American history, George Washington's personal copy of the Constitution, the original Louisiana Purchase Treaty, a moon rock, and dozens of other objects that most people had only seen in textbooks. The train stopped in small towns and large cities alike. People waited for hours in parking lots and on fairground fields to walk through the cars single file. For communities that did not have a major museum within driving distance or a bicentennial event of their own, the Freedom Train was the celebration. It brought the exhibit to the station, platform, and let people stand 3 feet from documents they would never see again. Number 88. The Ramones. In April 1976, the Ramones released their debut album. It contained 14 songs, ran under 30 minutes total, and sounded like nothing else on the radio. Every track was fast, loud, stripped to the frame, and over before the listener had time to settle into it. The album was recorded for a few $1,000s at a Manhattan studio, and the band had played most of the songs at CBGB, a club on the Bowery that smelled like spilled beer and stale sweat. The 4 members wore leather jackets and ripped jeans and took the same fake last name. They could not play their instruments with any particular finesse, and that was the entire statement. The Ramones did not sell many copies in 1976. But the album reached musicians in London, Los Angeles, and dozens of other cities who heard it and realized they did not need conservatory training to start a band. They just needed volume, speed, and nerve. Number 87. The Gong Show. Chuck Barris created The Gong Show and put it on daytime television in June 1976. The premise was blunt. Amateur performers took the stage and attempted to get through their act without being gonged into silence by a panel of celebrity judges. Most of them did not make it. Singers went flat. Comedians forgot their own punchlines. A man played the trumpet with a plunger stuck to his forehead. Barris hosted the show in a state of visible panic that may or may not have been an act, sweating through his shirt and laughing at moments that did not seem to warrant laughter. The Gong Show was lowbrow, chaotic, and occasionally embarrassing for everyone involved. It also pulled solid ratings, because in 1976, watching strangers fail on national television was a form of entertainment the country did not know it wanted until someone gave it to them. Number 86. A Star is Born. Barbra Streisand and Kris Kristofferson starred in the 1976 version of A Star is Born, the third retelling of the Hollywood story about a rising performer and the famous partner whose career is collapsing under the weight of addiction. Streisand played a singer on the way up, performing in small clubs until Kristofferson's fading rock star stumbles in and recognizes something the audience already knows. The reviews were mixed, and a few were openly hostile toward the production and its star's control over every element. The box office told a different story. The film became one of the highest-grossing releases of the year, driven largely by Streisand's audience and by her recording of Evergreen, which played on every soft rock and adult contemporary station through the winter holidays and won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. Critics could argue about the film. The soundtrack was beyond argument. In 1976, the film belonged to Streisand completely, and for her audience, that was always going to be enough to fill a theater. On a November evening in 1976, a movie opened in New York City that nobody in the industry expected to succeed. The lead actor was an unknown. The budget was small. The studio had tried to buy the script and hire a star, but the writer refused to sell unless he could play the lead himself. His name was Sylvester Stallone, and the movie was Rocky. The story was simple. A small-time boxer from Philadelphia gets a once-in-a-lifetime shot at the heavyweight championship. He trains in freezing cold mornings, punching slabs of meat in a freezer and running up the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. He falls in love with a shy woman who works at a pet store. And in the final round, bloodied and barely standing, he goes the distance against a champion everyone assumed would destroy him. Rocky was not about winning. It was about not quitting. And in 1976, that message connected with an audience that was still recovering from Watergate, the end of Vietnam, and a recession that had squeezed working families for years. It won the Academy Award for Best Picture, beating out All the President's Men, Network, and Taxi Driver. Stallone became a star overnight. The steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art became a landmark, and the image of a man in a gray sweatshirt raising his fists at the top of those steps became one of the most recognized moments in American film. Rocky did not just win awards. It gave an entire generation a reason to believe that showing up and refusing to stop was enough. Number 84. Hotel California. The Eagles released the single Hotel California in late 1976, and by the time it hit radio rotation, it sounded unlike anything the band had recorded before. The 12-string guitar intro was haunting and unmistakable. The Spanish-flavored arrangement built slowly. The lyrics described a traveler pulling off the highway and checking into a luxury hotel from which he could never leave. Disc jockeys played it twice in a row, and their switchboards lit up anyway. Listeners debated endlessly what the hotel represented. Was it about fame, excess, Los Angeles, the record industry itself? The Eagles never fully explained it, and Don Henley seemed to enjoy the confusion. The ambiguity only made people play it again, and Hotel California became one of those songs that everybody in the country could sing the opening bars of, whether they wanted to or not. Number 83. The Montreal Summer Olympics. The Summer Games opened in Montreal on July 17, 1976. Under a cloud of controversy and construction dust, the Olympic Stadium was unfinished. The signature tower meant to hold the retractable roof was still an exposed steel skeleton and would not be completed for another decade. The budget had ballooned so far beyond projections that Montreal's taxpayers would be paying off the debt for 30 years. 22 African nations boycotted the Games over New Zealand's continued rugby contact with apartheid-era South Africa. Taiwan withdrew entirely over a naming dispute with mainland China. Despite all of it, the competition delivered moments the world talked about for years. American boxers, including Sugar Ray Leonard and the Spinks brothers, won gold medals that launched professional careers. Swimmers broke records. The Romanian gymnastics squad, anchored by the 14-year-old phenom at number 79 on this list, stunned the arena and the television audience. The Montreal Olympics were messy, over budget, politically fractured, and unforgettable, which in 1976 described most things that ended up mattering. Number 82. Macrame. Knotted rope hung from every ceiling, held every plant, and decorated every wall in 1976. Macrame had moved from counterculture craft to suburban hobby in the span of a few years, and by the middle of the decade it was impossible to walk into a living room without seeing at least one plant hanger made of twisted jute cord. Craft stores sold the supplies by the yard. Instructional books lined the shelves at bookstores and libraries. Women gathered in living rooms and church basements to learn new knots and compare patterns. The projects grew more ambitious. Owls, wall hangings the size of tapestries, room dividers made entirely of rope. The material was cheap, the tools were basic, and the results ranged from elegant to alarming. Macrame was the kind of hobby that took over a house. Once it started, it spread to every room, and by 1976, most rooms had surrendered. Number 81. The Bad News Bears. Walter Matthau starred as a washed-up minor league pitcher hired to coach the worst Little League team in California's San Fernando Valley. The film opened in April 1976 and became a surprise hit because it did something that family movies rarely attempted. The kids cursed on screen, they threw punches, they lost games badly and often. Mathau's character drank beer in the dugout and showed up to practice visibly hungover. Tatum O'Neal played a girl pitcher whose fastball was better than anything the boys could throw. The film treated children like complicated, flawed, actual human beings instead of props for adult sentimentality. And audiences responded because every parent in the theater recognized at least one kid on that roster from their own neighborhood. In 1976, nobody demanded a content warning for a children's baseball film. They just bought a ticket and laughed. Number 80. Logan's Run. In a domed city of the future, every citizen lives in comfort and pleasure until the age of 30, at which point they are terminated in a public ritual called carousel. Michael York played a runner, an enforcer who hunts down citizens who try to flee, until the day he is assigned to find a rumored sanctuary outside the dome and decides he does not want to die on schedule either. The film opened in June 1976 and offered a sleek, brightly colored vision of a controlled future that looked like a shopping mall designed by someone who had never been outside. The special effects were ambitious for the budget. The ideas underneath, questions about youth culture, conformity, planned obsolescence, and who gets to decide when a life has value, landed with more force than most science fiction released that year. Logan's Run won an Academy Award for its visual effects and became a steady presence on late-night television for the next decade. Number 79. Nadia Comaneci's Perfect 10. At the 1976 Summer Olympics in Montreal, a 14-year-old gymnast from Romania stepped onto the uneven bars and performed a routine so flawless that the scoreboard could not display the result. The system had not been programmed for a 10.0. It showed 1.00 instead. And for a moment, the arena went quiet with confusion before the announcement clarified what had just happened. Nadia Comaneci had earned the first perfect score in Olympic gymnastics history. She went on to earn 6 more perfect tens during those games, winning 3 gold medals. The performance was broadcast around the world, and in the United States it captivated an audience that had never paid much attention to gymnastics before. Overnight, enrollment in gymnastics classes surged. Leotards appeared in department stores. Balance beams showed up in backyards. Comaneci did not just win. She raised the standard of what was considered possible, and she did it at an age when most American kids were still figuring out how to get through the 8th grade. Number 78. Mark the Bird Fidrych. In the spring of 1976, a curly-haired rookie pitcher for the Detroit Tigers started talking to the baseball before every pitch. He crouched on the mound, groomed the dirt with his bare hands, patted it smooth, and held conversations with the ball that no microphone could pick up. His name was Mark Fidrych, and the fans called him the Bird because his gangly frame and wild hair reminded them of Big Bird from Sesame Street. Fidrych won his first nationally televised start in front of a sold-out crowd at Tiger Stadium, and after that, every road game he pitched sold out too. Fans who had not watched baseball in years tuned in to see a 21-year-old talk to a baseball like it was a friend. He finished the season with a record and an earned run average that earned him the American League Rookie of the Year award. Injuries to his knee and shoulder cut his career short not long after. But in the summer of 1976, the Bird was the most joyful, unpredictable thing in all of professional sports, and nobody who watched him crouch on that mound and whisper to a ball ever forgot what it felt like to see someone love a game that much. Number 77. The Concorde. On January 21, 1976, the Concorde made its first commercial flights, departing simultaneously from London and Paris. The British Airways flight headed to Bahrain. The Air France flight went to Rio de Janeiro. For the first time in the history of commercial aviation, paying passengers traveled faster than the speed of sound. The aircraft cruised at over 1,300 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of any other commercial jet. It crossed the Atlantic in under 3.5 hours. A businessman could eat breakfast in Paris and arrive in New York before lunch. The sonic boom it produced rattled windows and prompted noise complaints from communities along the flight path. The United States initially restricted the Concorde from landing at certain airports over those concerns, though the restrictions were eventually lifted. Tickets cost several times more than a first-class fare on a regular airline. The Concorde was never meant for everyone. It was a technological marvel aimed at people who could afford to buy back time. And in 1976, it proved that the future of travel had arrived, even if most people could only watch it from the ground. Number 76. Jimmy Carter's Peanut Campaign. A peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, entered the 1976 presidential race as a relative unknown, and by the time Election Day arrived in November, he had beaten Gerald Ford and become the next president of the United States. Carter campaigned on honesty. His most repeated promise was simple: he would never lie to them. In a country still bruised by Watergate, that sentence carried more weight than any policy paper. His supporters wore peanut pins, peanut hats, and peanut necklaces. His grin appeared on buttons from coast to coast. The peanut became a political symbol, shorthand for a candidate who came from somewhere real, who had worked with his hands, and who had no ties to the Washington establishment that the public no longer trusted. Carter won by a narrow margin, carrying the South and enough of the industrial Midwest to secure the presidency. The peanut farmer was headed to the White House, and 1976 had chosen its president. Number 75. Skateboarding. By 1976, skateboarding had gone from a California curiosity to a nationwide pastime. The boards were wider and heavier than anything sold today, with clay or composite wheels and loose trucks that made every ride an act of faith. Kids built ramps out of plywood and cinder blocks in driveways and empty lots. The first commercial skate parks were opening in California and Florida, with banked walls and concrete bowls that attracted crowds of teenagers and the occasional broken wrist. The Zephyr team out of Santa Monica had turned skating into something closer to surfing on pavement, and their style spread through magazine photos and word of mouth. There were no helmets. There were no pads. A bad fall meant road rash and a torn pair of jeans, and you got back on. Skateboarding in 1976 was raw, dangerous, and completely unsupervised, which was exactly why every kid on the block wanted to try it. Number 74. The ABA-NBA merger. In June 1976, the American Basketball Association officially ceased to exist. 4 of its surviving teams, the New York Nets, the Denver Nuggets, the Indiana Pacers, and the San Antonio Spurs, were absorbed into the NBA. The rest were dissolved and their players scattered into a dispersal draft. The ABA had been the flashier, more freewheeling league for 9 seasons, the one with the red, white, and blue basketball, the three-point line that the NBA did not yet use, and the slam dunk contest that turned individual expression into a spectator event. Its rosters included Julius Erving, George Gervin, and Moses Malone, players whose talent belonged on any court in the world. But the league had been hemorrhaging money for years, and by 1976, the merger was less a partnership than a surrender. The NBA absorbed the talent and left behind an era of barnstorming, wide-open basketball that fans in smaller markets never got back. The three-point line came over eventually, and the dunk contest followed. But it took years for the NBA to admit it had inherited the best ideas from the league it swallowed. Number 73. The Donnie and Marie Show. ABC launched the Donnie and Marie variety show in January 1976, and it became a fixture on Friday nights almost immediately. Donnie Osmond sang pop, Marie Osmond sang country. They bickered about it in a recurring bit that the studio audience never seemed to tire of, no matter how many times the format repeated. The set was bright, the guest stars were big, the ice skating segments were elaborate, and the whole production radiated a squeaky clean wholesomeness that felt deliberately out of step with the grittier, more cynical tone of most 1976 entertainment. The show drew enormous ratings, particularly among families who wanted something the whole house could sit through on a Friday evening without anyone flinching or reaching for the dial. In a decade that gave television All in the Family and Saturday Night Live, Donnie and Marie proved there was still a massive audience for a show where nobody swore and the biggest conflict was pop versus country. Number 72. Drive-in movies. By 1976, there were still thousands of drive-in theaters scattered across the country, though the number was shrinking every year. The land they sat on was becoming more valuable than the tickets they sold, and developers were circling. But on a warm Friday night in the summer of 1976, none of that mattered. The lot filled up an hour before dark. Station wagons backed into spots and lowered tailgates. Families spread blankets on the hoods of their cars. Kids in pajamas climbed into the back seat with pillows and fell asleep before the second feature started. The speaker hung on a metal post next to the driver's window, and you hooked it onto the glass and adjusted the volume with a dial that crackled no matter what you did. The sound was never good. The picture was never sharp. Mosquitoes circled the screen. The concession stand sold hot dogs that tasted better at 10 o'clock at night than any hot dog had a right to taste, and the popcorn came in red and white striped tubs that leaked butter through the bottom. Nobody went to the drive-in for picture quality. They went because it was cheap, because you could bring the whole family in one car for the price of a few tickets, and because something about watching a movie outdoors, with the engine ticking cool and the stars visible above the screen, made the whole experience feel bigger than the film itself. Double features ran well past midnight. Teenagers parked in the back rows and ignored the movie entirely. And when it was over, the headlights came on across the lot in a slow wave, and the line to the exit stretched all the way to the road. The drive-in was never the best way to watch a movie, but in 1976, it was the most American way to watch one, and the families who went never forgot the feeling of the gravel under the tires as they pulled in. Number 71. The Omen. Richard Donner's The Omen opened in June 1976 and offered a horror film dressed in diplomatic tailoring and classical music. Gregory Peck played Robert Thorne, an American ambassador to Britain who gradually realizes that the child he and his wife are raising may not be entirely human. The film treated its premise with dead seriousness, staging each death as an elaborate, almost operatic set piece that audiences replayed in conversation for days afterward. A priest impaled by a lightning rod, a photographer decapitated by a sheet of glass. Jerry Goldsmith's choral score, heavy with Latin liturgical text, won the Academy Award and gave the film a weight that most horror releases could not approach. The Omen proved that a horror film could draw an audience that would not normally walk into a theater showing one, and in the summer of 1976, it competed with blockbusters on their own terms and held its ground. Number 70. Carrie. Brian De Palma's adaptation of Stephen King's first published novel opened in November 1976 and changed what a horror film was allowed to look like. Sissy Spacek played Carrie White, a bullied, isolated high school girl with a telekinetic power she barely understands, living under the control of a fanatically religious mother played by Piper Laurie in a performance that bordered on operatic. The prom scene became one of the most referenced sequences in American film history. The slow-motion pour of the blood, the split-screen destruction, the gymnasium in flames. The hand shooting out of the dirt in the final shot sent audiences out of the theater with their hearts in their throats. Carrie made Stephen King a household name and proved that a mass-market paperback horror novel could become a prestige film with Academy Award nominations. It also guaranteed that no one who watched it in a theater in 1976 ever felt entirely comfortable at a school dance again. Number 69. The July 4th Bicentennial. The United States turned 200 years old on July 4, 1976, and the country threw a party that touched every city, every town, and nearly every front yard in America. New York Harbor filled with tall ships from around the world in a parade that millions watched from the shoreline and millions more watched on television. Fireworks displays lasted longer and climbed higher than any that had come before. Bands played in town squares. Parades wound through neighborhoods with fire trucks draped in bunting and children waving flags from the curb. Fire hydrants were painted red, white, and blue. So were mailboxes, fence posts, barber poles, and the occasional dog. The bicentennial was not a single event. It was a mood that lasted the entire year. Commemorative plates, coins, belt buckles, and t-shirts filled every gift shop in the country. After Vietnam, after Watergate, after a recession that had squeezed the middle class for years, the bicentennial offered something simple, a reason to feel good about the country, even if just for a long weekend, and most people took it. Number 68. The first women admitted to the service academies. In the summer of 1976, women reported to West Point, the United States Naval Academy, and the Air Force Academy for the first time in the history of those institutions. Congress had authorized their admission the previous year after decades of exclusion, and the first classes arrived that July carrying the same duffel bags as everyone else and facing a reception that ranged from cautious to openly hostile. They were met with physical training standards that had been designed without their bodies in mind, regulations that had never accounted for their presence, uniforms that did not fit properly, and a student body that was not unanimously supportive of the change. Some upperclassmen made the adjustment harder than it needed to be. The women who survived that first year did so by meeting or exceeding every benchmark put in front of them. By the time they graduated 4 years later, the argument over whether they belonged had been largely settled by the fact that they were still standing. The service academies did not change because attitudes shifted first. They changed because Congress said they would, and the women who walked through those gates in 1976 bore the weight of proving it could work. Number 67. Evel Knievel Toys. Evel Knievel was the most famous daredevil in America, and by 1976 his face was on everything a kid could want. The Ideal Toy Company sold the Evel Knievel Stunt Cycle, a wind-up motorcycle with a plastic figure that launched off a ramp and flew across the living room floor. Kids cranked the mechanism, set the ramp, and watched Evel sail over rows of toy cars, stuffed animals, and whatever else they could stack in a line. The toy was nearly indestructible, which was good, because it hit walls, table legs, and siblings with impressive frequency. There were also action figures, a scramble van, and a canyon sky cycle. Keimel's real jumps were broadcast on television and talked about at school the next day. The crashes were legendary. The toys let every kid in America recreate them on the kitchen floor, which is exactly what they did, over and over, until the ramp broke or bedtime arrived. Number 66. Frampton Comes Alive. Peter Frampton's live album dropped in January of 1976 and became the best-selling live album in American history at the time. It stayed on the Billboard charts for most of the year. The sound of the talkbox, a device that made the guitar seem to speak in vowels, became one of the most recognizable sonic signatures of the decade. Do you feel like we do stretched past 14 minutes? Show Me the Way played on every FM radio station in the country. The album showed up at parties, at the beach, in parked cars with the windows down. Frampton was not new. He had been performing since his teenage years in England. But this album turned him into something larger, a live performer who could hold an arena in the palm of his hand. The double album sold millions of copies in 1976 alone, and for a stretch of months, that year Peter Frampton was the biggest rock star on the planet. Number 65. The presidential debates return. On September 23, 1976, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter stood behind podiums at the Walnut Street Theater in Philadelphia for the first televised presidential debate since Kennedy and Nixon had faced each other 16 years earlier in 1960. The country had gone through assassinations, Vietnam, Watergate, and a presidential resignation without a single face-to-face televised exchange between the two people asking for the job. The first debate drew an audience of tens of millions and re-established a tradition that has continued in every election since. The second debate, held in San Francisco, produced a moment that followed Ford for the rest of his campaign. He stated flatly that Eastern Europe was not under Soviet domination, and when the moderator gave him a chance to walk it back, he doubled down instead. In 1976, a single unforced error on live television could still reshape the trajectory of a presidential race, and Ford's stumble did exactly that. Number 64. Barbara Walters on the evening news. In April 1976, ABC News announced that Barbara Walters would join Harry Reasoner as co-anchor of the evening news broadcast, making her the first woman to hold that position at any of the three major networks. The salary, reported widely as $1 million a year, generated nearly as many headlines as the hire itself and prompted debate over whether any news anchor, male or female, was worth that figure. Her co-anchor, Harry Reasoner, made little effort to disguise his displeasure, and the on-air chemistry between them was, by most accounts, non-existent. Walters pressed forward regardless, secured exclusive interviews that drew audiences ABC's evening broadcast had not seen before, and established a presence on the network that long outlasted Reasoner's discomfort. In 1976, a woman reading the evening news at 6:30 on a major network was still considered an experiment by the industry that employed her. Number 63. The Bicentennial Minute. Every night on CBS, just before the late local news, a 1-minute segment aired in which a notable public figure narrated a single moment from American history that had happened exactly 200 years before on that date. The Bicentennial Minute ran nightly from July 4, 1974, through December 31, 1976. Presidents, Actors, athletes, scientists, journalists, and military leaders each took a turn reading a short script about a battle, a debate, a letter, or a decision from the Revolutionary era. The segments were brief, earnest, and delivered with varying degrees of dramatic commitment. Most of them aired at a time of night when only the dedicated were still watching. But the Bicentennial Minute gave the country a daily ritual, a small recurring reminder that the nation was counting down to a birthday that everybody knew was coming, 1 minute at a time. Number 62. Super Bowl 10. The Pittsburgh Steelers defeated the Dallas Cowboys 21-17 in January 1976 in a game that came down to a final drive and a defensive stand. Lynn Swann made a leaping, twisting sideline catch against Mark Washington that became one of the most replayed moments in Super Bowl history. A grab so athletic that even Cowboys fans had trouble denying its beauty. The game was played at the Orange Bowl in Miami on a warm January afternoon, and the broadcast drew one of the largest television audiences of the year. Super Bowl Sunday was not yet the unofficial national holiday it would become in later decades, but in 1976 it was getting there. Families planned the afternoon around kickoff. Grocery stores sold out of chips, dip, and cold cuts by noon. Office pools appeared on Monday morning desks. The ritual was still forming, but the shape of what it would become was already clear to anyone paying attention. Number 61. Dorothy Hamill's wedge haircut. Dorothy Hamill won the gold medal in figure skating at the Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, Austria, in February 1976, and within weeks of her victory, hair salons across the United States were fielding an avalanche of requests for her haircut. The wedge was short and layered in the back, angled forward toward the chin, and it moved when she spun on the ice in a way that made the whole style look effortless on a television screen. It was considerably less effortless in a bathroom mirror with a pair of scissors and a comb. Women and teenage girls brought magazine clippings to their hairdressers and left the salon with results that varied widely depending on hair texture, head shape, and the skill of the person holding the scissors. The Dorothy Hamill wedge became the single most requested haircut in the country that year, and for an entire season, every ice skating rink in America had at least one young girl trying to land a spin that looked half as graceful as the one she had seen on television. Number 60. Disco. By 1976, disco was no longer underground. It had moved from the clubs of New York City into the mainstream of American culture, and the dance floor was suddenly the center of social life for millions. The Bee Gees, Donna Summer, Casey, and the Sunshine Band. The music was relentless, rhythmic, and designed to keep bodies moving under spinning lights. Dance clubs opened in cities and suburbs alike. Mirror balls hung from ceilings. Polyester shimmered. The clothing changed, the hair changed. The way people spent their weekends changed. Disco was not just a genre, it was a lifestyle that prioritized dressing up, going out, and being seen. The backlash was already building by the end of the decade, but in 1976 disco was still ascending, still exciting, still the sound of a country trying to shake off the heaviness of the early 70s. Vietnam was over. Watergate was receding. The recession was loosening its grip, and the dance floor offered something uncomplicated. A place to stop thinking and start moving. For a lot of Americans in 1976, that was exactly what they needed. Number 59. Boston's debut album. In August 1976, a band called Boston released a debut album that had been recorded mostly in a basement in Watertown, Massachusetts. Tom Scholz, the band's guitarist and primary songwriter, was an engineer at Polaroid by day and a perfectionist in his home studio by night. He had spent years layering guitar tracks, adjusting the reverb, and polishing every note until the recordings sounded like nothing that had come out of a basement before. The album's opening track, More Than a Feeling, hit radio and stayed there. The guitar tone was thick and layered. The vocals soared. The production was so clean that listeners assumed it had been made in a major studio with a large budget. It had not. Epic Records had signed the band partly on the strength of demo tapes that Scholes had mixed in his own apartment. The album sold millions of copies in its first year and eventually became one of the best-selling debut albums in American history. In 1976, the idea that a person could build something that enormous in a basement with reel-to-reel tape and a soldering iron was not yet a cliché. It was just Tom Scholz, alone with his equipment, refusing to stop until it sounded right. Number 58. The Death of Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes died on April 5, 1976, aboard a private jet flying from Acapulco to a hospital in Houston. He was 70 years old. The man who had once been the most famous aviator, filmmaker, and industrialist in America had spent his final years sealed inside darkened hotel rooms, attended by a small circle of aides, eating the same foods in the same order, and refusing contact with almost everyone who had once known him. His fingernails had grown long. His frame had withered. His empire, which included airlines, movie studios, casinos, and defense contracts, had been managed by proxies for years. When the news broke, the questions that followed were almost as large as the fortune he left behind. There was no clear will. Relatives, associates, and total strangers claimed pieces of an estate that was worth hundreds of millions. Lawsuits multiplied for years. The Howard Hughes story had been extraordinary from the beginning. A young Texan who flew faster than anyone alive, dated Hollywood actresses, built aircraft that changed aviation, and then slowly retreated from the world until the world could no longer reach him. His death in 1976 did not bring clarity. It only deepened the mystery of how a man who had once owned the sky ended up afraid of the light. Number 57. Hank Aaron's final season. Hank Aaron played his last Major League Baseball game on October 3, 1976, as a designated hitter for the Milwaukee Brewers, the city where his career had started more than 2 decades earlier with the Milwaukee Braves. He had broken Babe Ruth's all-time home run record on April 8, 1974, in Atlanta, enduring a torrent of death threats, hate mail, and racial abuse to reach a number that many believed would never be touched. By 1976, the fury had faded into something quieter and more respectful. Aaron finished his career with 755 home runs, a total that would stand as the record for more than 3 decades. His final season was not dramatic. He appeared in fewer games, hit a handful of home runs, drove in runs when called upon, and walked off the diamond for the last time in the same city where he had first walked onto it. There was no farewell tour. There was no theatrics. That was how Aaron had always done it. Number 56. The Big Red Machine. The Cincinnati Reds won their second consecutive World Series in October 1976, sweeping the New York Yankees in 4 straight games and cementing their place as one of the most dominant teams in baseball history. The roster read like a future Hall of Fame ballot. Johnny Bench behind the plate, Joe Morgan at second base, Pete Rose at third, Tony Perez at first, Ken Griffey Sr. in the outfield. The Reds had won 102 games during the regular season and then walked through the postseason, losing only once before meeting the Yankees and not losing at all. The sweep was thorough and businesslike. Baseball historians have argued for decades about where the 1976 Reds rank among the greatest teams ever assembled. The players on that roster never seemed to care much about the ranking. They just kept showing up and winning until there was no one left to play. Number 55. String trimmers. Before the mid-1970s, the edges of the lawn were handled with hand shears or ignored entirely. The weed eater, introduced a few years earlier, was just starting to appear in garages across the country by 1976, and it changed the definition of a finished yard overnight. The tool used a spinning piece of nylon line to cut grass and weeds along fences, sidewalks, and the bases of trees where a mower could not reach. The noise was high-pitched and relentless. The line snapped constantly and had to be refed by hand, a process that took longer than the actual trimming. But the results were undeniable. A yard with clean edges looked complete. A yard without them looked abandoned. By the end of the decade, the string trimmer was as standard as the lawnmower itself. In 1976, it was still a novelty, and the neighbor who had one was quietly envied by everyone on the block. Number 54. Bruce Jenner and the decathlon. At the Montreal Olympics, in late July 1976, Bruce Jenner won the decathlon with a world record score that was not seriously challenged. The decathlon, 10 events spread across 2 grueling days, had long been considered the ultimate test of all-around athletic ability, and Jenner had spent 4 years training for the moment with a single-mindedness that left little room for anything else. The final event was the 1500 meters. By the time Jenner crossed the finish line, the gold medal was already mathematically locked. An American flag appeared in the crowd, and Jenner grabbed it and ran a victory lap that became one of the defining images of the Montreal Games. Within weeks, the photograph was on the front of the Wheaties cereal box, and Jenner's face appeared on breakfast tables and magazine covers across the country. In 1976, winning the decathlon made you the greatest athlete in the world, and for one summer, nobody argued. Number 53. The Oakland Raiders. The Oakland Raiders capped their 1976 season by winning Super Bowl XI in January 1977, dismantling the Minnesota Vikings in a game that was not as close as the final score suggested. The Raiders had spent years as one of the best teams in football without winning the championship, and the 1976 squad was built to end that drought with force. Ken Stabler threw with a calm that bordered on indifference to pressure. Fred Biletnikoff ran precise routes in silver and black. The defensive line, anchored by players who hit first and apologized never, set a tone that opposing offenses felt in their ribs the next morning. The team played its home games at the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum, a no-frills concrete stadium in a working-class city, and its fans dressed in silver and black face paint and treated every home game like a controlled riot. The 1976 Raiders were not beloved outside the Bay Area. They did not care. They were just better than everyone else, and in January they proved it. Number 52. The Chevy Chevette. General Motors introduced the Chevette as its answer to the fuel crisis of the early 1970s, and by 1976 the small hatchback was one of the best-selling cars in America. It was cheap to buy, cheap to insure, and basic in every sense of the word. The engine was a 1.4-liter four-cylinder that produced modest horsepower and even more modest acceleration. The interior was plain vinyl and hard plastic. The ride was rough on highways and noisy at any speed above 40, none of that stopped people from buying it, because the Chevette sipped gasoline at a time when the memory of long lines at the pump was still fresh and the price per gallon was still a sore subject at the dinner table. Thus, the Chevette was not a car that people fell in love with. It was a car that people could afford, and in 1976, affordability was its own kind of loyalty. Number 51. The Volkswagen Rabbit. Volkswagen had retired the Beetle and replaced it with the Rabbit, and by 1976, the boxy little hatchback was a common sight in suburban driveways, college campus parking lots, and the employee sections of office parks. It handled well on winding roads. It returned good fuel economy. It looked nothing like the rounded, air-cooled bug it had succeeded, which was either a relief or a betrayal depending on who you asked. Some loyal VW owners mourned the Beetle's simplicity and character, its engine in the trunk and its shape that had not changed in decades. Others appreciated that the Rabbit had a water-cooled engine, front-wheel drive, and a rear hatch that could swallow a surprising amount of groceries or luggage. The Rabbit never developed the cultural personality of the Beetle. It never inspired bumper stickers or affectionate nicknames. But in 1976, it was the sensible European import, the practical choice that started on cold mornings, and practical was enough to keep it selling. Number 50. The Digital Watch. By 1976, the digital watch had completed a rapid journey from expensive novelty to mass-market commodity in barely 2 years. Early models with red LED displays had cost several $100s when they first appeared. By the middle of the year, Discount stores and drugstores carried versions for under $20. You pressed a small button on the side and the time appeared in glowing red numerals against a dark face. Release the button and the display went blank again, saving battery life. Kids wore them to school and pressed the button constantly, sometimes just to watch the numbers appear. Adults wore them to meetings and checked the time with a quick tap, trying to look casual about it. The LCD version, which displayed the time continuously without pressing anything, was already arriving, and within a couple of years it would replace the LED entirely. But in 1976, the digital watch still felt like the future, and the future was something you strapped to your wrist and showed to anyone who would look. Number 49. Home smoke detectors. By 1976, battery-powered smoke detectors had become cheap enough for nearly any household to own one, and fire safety campaigns were pushing hard to get a detector on every floor of every home. Before their widespread adoption, most houses relied on nothing more than a nose and a light sleeper to detect a fire in the night. The early residential models were round, beige, and screwed into the ceiling with a pair of screws and a mounting bracket. They ran on a single 9-volt battery that lasted roughly a year. When the battery ran low, the detector emitted a single chirp every 60 seconds, usually beginning at 3 in the morning, and finding the right replacement battery at that hour became one of the recurring domestic dramas of the decade. The devices worked. Fire deaths in American homes began a measurable decline as adoption rates climbed through the late 1970s, and by the end of the decade, the smoke detector had become as standard a fixture as the doorbell. Number 48. The Chia Pet. The Chia Pet arrived on the American novelty market in the late 1970s, but the terracotta and seed concept behind it was already circulating through gift shops and mail-order catalogs by 1976. The idea was simple enough. Soak a hollow clay figure in water, spread chia seeds over its grooved surface, keep it moist, and watch green sprouts emerge over the course of a week or two. The result was a small ceramic animal, usually a ram or a puppy, covered in what looked like a thin layer of alfalfa grass. The sprouts grew unevenly and browned if you forgot to water them. The television jingle, when it eventually aired, embedded itself in the memory of anyone who heard it. Chia Pets became one of the most reliable novelty gifts in the country, the kind of thing that appeared under a Christmas tree when nobody knew what else to buy and everyone laughed anyway. Number 47. Bicentennial fire hydrants. Across the country in 1976, volunteer groups, scout troops, garden clubs, and neighborhood associations painted fire hydrants to look like Revolutionary War soldiers, Uncle Sam, Betsy Ross, or simple red, white, and blue stripes. The fire department did not always approve. In some towns, officials pointed out that non-standard colors made it harder for firefighters to identify hydrant flow rates at a glance. In most places, nobody stopped the painters anyway. A freshly decorated fire hydrant became the most visible sign that a block or a neighborhood had decided to participate in the bicentennial celebration, even if the community budget did not stretch to a parade or a fireworks show. Some of those painted hydrants stayed bright for years. Others faded in the weather within a single season. But in the summer of 1976, they lined residential streets from New England to California like a folk art exhibition that nobody had planned and everybody recognized. Number 46. The Bicentennial Block Party. On the 4th of July 1976, neighborhoods across America closed off their streets, dragged folding tables and card tables onto the asphalt, and threw parties that had been planned for weeks or thrown together overnight. Bunting hung from porch railings and mailbox posts, charcoal grills smoked on every corner. Kids ran through lawn sprinklers in bare feet, while adults sat in aluminum lawn chairs and watched the world go by from the middle of the road. Some blocks organized formal activities: sack races, watermelon eating contests, pie judging competitions, horseshoe tournaments. Others just let the afternoon happen on its own and cleaned up the paper plates when it got dark. The Bicentennial Block Party was not a single national event. It was thousands of separate ones, each slightly different. each built on the same unspoken agreement that this particular 4th of July deserved something bigger than the usual backyard cookout. Number 45. The puka shell necklace. In 1976, puka shell necklaces were everywhere. The trend had started in Hawaii, where the naturally occurring cone-shaped shell fragments washed up on beaches and were strung into short, tight chokers by local craftspeople. Surfers carried the look to the mainland, and from there it spread to department store jewelry counters, beach shops, and teenage necks in landlocked states that had never seen the Pacific. Boys and girls both wore them. The shells were white, smooth, and strung close together on a cord or thin leather strip that sat right at the base of the throat. A genuine puka necklace from Hawaii cost a few dollars. The mainland imitations, made from cut and polished shell or plastic, cost less. By the end of the year, the trend was starting to fade, but for a stretch of 1976, puka shells were the easiest way to signal that you were laid back and coastal, even if you had never left Ohio. Number 44. The conversation pit. The sunken conversation pit had been a fixture of ambitious living room design since the early 1960s, and by 1976 it was at the height of its popularity in middle-class homes. The concept was simple. The floor dropped down 2 or 3 steps in the center of the room, creating a recessed area lined with built-in bench seating and thick cushions. A coffee table or a small fireplace anchored the center. Guests descended into the pit and sat facing each other, which was supposed to encourage intimate conversation. In practice, it encouraged spilled drinks, stubbed toes, and visiting relatives who did not notice the step change after a second highball. Children used it as a fort. Teenagers used it as a theater. The dog used it as a bed. The conversation pit looked spectacular in shelter magazines and Sunday real estate supplements. In daily life, it was a place where a family threw blankets, dropped cereal, and occasionally forgot about the step until someone reminded them the hard way. Number 43. The swine flu vaccination program. In February of 1976, a young soldier at Fort Dix, New Jersey, fell ill with a strain of influenza that scientists identified as closely related to the virus behind the devastating 1918 pandemic. The discovery triggered an alarm inside the federal government. President Gerald Ford, acting on the advice of top health officials, ordered a nationwide vaccination campaign to inoculate every American before winter arrived. The program moved fast. Vaccine production ramped up across multiple manufacturers. Clinics were set up in schools, community centers, and shopping mall parking lots. By October, tens of millions of Americans had rolled up their sleeves. Television cameras broadcast the effort. The president himself was vaccinated on camera to build public confidence. Then the reports started coming in. A small number of vaccinated individuals developed Guillain-Barré syndrome, a rare neurological condition that caused muscle weakness and, in severe cases, temporary paralysis. The overall numbers were small relative to the total vaccinations administered, but the media coverage was intense and public trust eroded quickly. By December, the program was suspended entirely. The feared pandemic never arrived. The virus that had killed the soldier at Fort Dix did not spread beyond the base in any meaningful way. The 1976 swine flu affair became one of the most studied episodes in the history of American public health, a case that raised difficult questions about how governments should respond to uncertain threats, how quickly science should act when data is incomplete, and what happens when the prevention itself becomes the story. Those questions never went away. They resurfaced decades later, under different circumstances, and the lessons of 1976 were cited every single time. Number 42. Home milk delivery. The milkman still came to the door in 1976, though his route was getting shorter every year. A metal box sat on the front porch or beside the side entrance, and before dawn a truck rumbled through the neighborhood dropping off glass bottles of whole milk, sometimes chocolate milk, and occasionally eggs or butter. The empties went back into the box, rinsed and ready to be collected. The system was simple, reliable, and had been running in some neighborhoods for decades. But the supermarket was cheaper. Plastic jugs were lighter and did not break when a child dropped them, and the convenience of buying milk during the regular grocery trip made the delivery seem like an unnecessary extra. By the end of the decade, home milk delivery had all but disappeared from most American streets. The milkman was still making rounds in 1976, but the sound of his truck in the dark was growing fainter every year. Number 41. The television antenna rotor. On the roof of every house that did not subscribe to cable, a metal television antenna pointed at the nearest broadcast tower. When the picture drifted or a channel came from a different direction, someone in the living room went to the small control box sitting on top of the television and turned a dial. Up on the roof, the rotor motor groaned to life and slowly swung the antenna on its mast until the picture cleared on the screen. The process was not fast, it was not quiet, and on windy nights, the antenna sometimes drifted on its own, pushed by a gust, sending the picture into rolling static until someone got up from the couch, crossed the room, and adjusted the dial again. In 1976, watching television was not a passive activity. It required occasional mechanical intervention, a willingness to stand up, and the patience to wait while a motor on the roof decided where to point. Number 40. The above-ground pool. By 1976, above-ground swimming pools had become the backyard status symbol of choice for families who could not afford the cost of digging a hole and pouring concrete for an in-ground version. The round metal-walled pools stood about 4 feet high, held a few thousand gallons of water, and came with a small filter pump that hummed all summer long. A vinyl liner kept the water inside the structure. A removable ladder on the outside let you climb over the wall and drop in. Kids spent entire afternoons circling the perimeter in the same direction to create a whirlpool current, then lifted their feet and let the water carry them. The water turned green if you forgot the chlorine for a few days. The liner tore if someone brushed against it with a belt buckle or a sharp toenail. Algae grew on the walls by August. None of it mattered in the least. In 1976, if you had a pool in the backyard, you had the most popular house on the block, and everything else was a detail. Number 39. Charlie's Angels. The show premiered on ABC in September of 1976 and immediately became the most discussed new program on television. The setup was simple. 3 women worked as private detectives for a mysterious boss they never met face to face. The voice on the speakerphone gave the assignments. Farrah Fawcett, Kate Jackson, and Jacqueline Smith handled the rest. The show was flashy, fast-paced, and built unashamedly around the appeal of its leads. Critics dismissed it as lightweight. Feminist commentators debated whether it empowered or exploited its stars. And every Wednesday night, tens of millions of viewers tuned in regardless. Charlie's Angels launched a wave of merchandise, copycat hairstyles, and Halloween costumes that lasted for years. It also proved something the networks had been slow to recognize. A show built around 3 women, even one wrapped in glamour and car chases, could dominate the ratings in prime time. In 1976, Charlie's Angels was not trying to make a statement. It was trying to win the night, and it did. Number 38. The neighborhood swimming pool. Summer in 1976 meant the community pool. Not a private pool in the backyard, though some families had those, but the public or neighborhood pool where the entire block gathered from Memorial Day to Labor Day. The admission was low enough that kids could cover it with coins saved from chores. The water was blue with chlorine and cold enough to take your breath away on the first jump. The concrete deck was hot enough to burn bare feet by noon. Lifeguards sat in tall white chairs blowing whistles at anyone who ran. The snack bar sold popsicles and candy bars through a window with a screen that never closed all the way. Marco Polo games, cannonballs off the high dive, breath-holding contests that nobody timed accurately. The pool was social infrastructure disguised as recreation. Parents talked on lounge chairs while kids swam until their fingers pruned and their eyes turned red. Nobody applied sunscreen. Nobody packed a water bottle, and nobody left until the long whistle blew and the lifeguard pointed at the gate. Number 37. The Columbia House Record Club. The advertisement appeared in the back pages of nearly every magazine sold in America in 1976. 12 records for a penny. The offer sounded impossibly generous, and it was printed in bold type next to a grid of album covers that included nearly everything a teenager could want. All you had to do was fill out the postcard, check the boxes next to your 12 selections, tape a penny to the form, and drop it in the mailbox. In return, you agreed to purchase a certain number of additional records at regular club prices over the next year or two. The initial shipment arrived in a flat cardboard box, and the thrill of opening it and spreading a dozen albums across the bedroom floor was real and immediate. The bills that followed were less thrilling. The regular price records were expensive. The monthly selections arrived automatically unless you mailed back a rejection card in time. Canceling the membership required a letter, sometimes a phone call, and occasionally a second letter written in a firmer tone. Columbia House understood something basic about human nature. The joy of receiving 12 albums in the mail would always outweigh the slow-motion annoyance of paying for the next 6. Number 36. Corningware. The white ceramic baking dishes with the blue cornflower pattern were in nearly every kitchen in America by 1976. Corningware could go from the freezer to the oven to the table without cracking, and that was the selling point, delivered without exaggeration. Casseroles, baked beans, scalloped potatoes, and anything involving a can of cream of mushroom soup ended up in a Corningware dish at some point during the week. The pieces were handed down from mothers to daughters and treated more carefully than some family heirlooms, despite costing far less. They lasted for decades. The blue cornflower pattern became so linked to American home cooking that spotting a piece in a thrift store today triggers immediate recognition. Corningware was never glamorous. It was dependable, heat-resistant, and always within reach of the oven mitt. In 1976, it was the dish that held dinner together, and it never asked for acknowledgement. Number 35. The wood-paneled basement rec room. In 1976, the finished basement was often the room where the family actually spent its time. The walls were lined with thin sheets of wood grain paneling, the kind that came in 4x8 sheets and went up with a tube of adhesive and a few finishing nails. The floor was indoor-outdoor carpet in brown, dark green, or a color that split the difference. A second-hand sofa sat against one wall. A television set sat against the other. In some houses, there was a pool table with a tear in the felt. In others, a dartboard hung on the paneling, surrounded by small holes where darts had missed. A handful of houses had a bar built from plywood, stained dark and lined with contact paper, with 2 stools and a row of glasses that were never the right size for anything. The rec room smelled faintly of mildew, carpet glue, and the particular staleness of air that had been circulated through a basement for years. It was where the kids went after school, where the teenagers went on Friday nights, where the adults retreated when the upstairs got too small. It was not an elegant room. Nobody expected it to be. Number 34. The hi-fi stereo console. The stereo console was as much a piece of furniture as it was a piece of audio equipment. It stood waist-high, stretched 3 or 4 feet wide, and housed a turntable, an AM/FM radio tuner, and a pair of speakers behind fabric-covered panels, all enclosed in a cabinet of real walnut or convincing walnut grain veneer. The console sat in the living room or the den like a low altar to recorded sound. Families played records on weekend mornings. Teenagers dropped the needle on albums after school and turned the volume up until someone in the next room told them to turn it down. The speakers were warm, the bass was full. The turntable platter spun at a speed that felt ceremonial when you watched it. By 1976, the separate component stereo system with stacked receivers, dedicated speakers, and a standalone turntable was already replacing the console in stores and in the minds of serious audio buyers. But the all-in-one console had a physical presence that no stack of silver-faced components could match. It was heavy, it was difficult to move, and when it played a record, the whole room knew it. Number 33. Tiger Beat Magazine. Every month, Tiger Beat delivered a fresh supply of pull-out posters, fan letters, breathless celebrity profiles, and full-page photographs of whichever young actor or singer had captured the attention of the American teenage population that season. In 1976, the magazine featured the stars of Happy Days, the Osmonds, and whatever new face had appeared on a television variety show that month and generated mail. The pages were printed on thin paper that smelled like cheap ink and tore easily if you were not careful removing the centerfold poster. The posters went straight to bedroom walls, secured with tape, thumbtacks, or small squares of putty that left marks the landlord would eventually notice. Tiger Beat never pretended to be journalism. It was devotion in print. For millions of teenagers in 1976, it was the closest available thing to a personal connection with someone whose face they saw on television but would almost certainly never meet in person. Number 32. The Bathroom Magazine Rack. Every bathroom in 1976 had one. A small wire or wicker basket sitting on the floor beside the toilet, stuffed with reading material that ranged from Reader's Digest to National Geographic to a Sunday paper from 3 weeks ago. The bathroom was the only room in the house where a person could sit alone, undisturbed, for 10 full minutes, and the magazine rack existed to fill that time. Issues accumulated slowly and rotated even more slowly. A Reader's Digest from February might still be in the stack come September. Articles were absorbed in fragments, a column or two per visit, over weeks and months. Nobody discussed the bathroom magazine rack. It was not a design feature. It was not a conversation piece. It was simply present, the way the towel bar was present, and in 1976, a bathroom without one felt like it was missing something fundamental. Number 31. The Garage Sale. On any given Saturday morning in 1976, handwritten signs appeared at intersections, taped to telephone poles, and stapled to fence posts. Garage sale. The driveway was covered with folding tables and card tables, and everything the family no longer wanted was arranged with masking tape price tags. Baby clothes, vinyl records, kitchen gadgets with fraying cords, board games missing half the pieces, and lamps that had not been plugged in since the Johnson administration. Neighbors walked over in bathrobes with coffee mugs in hand. Strangers pulled up in station wagons and browsed with purpose. Prices were negotiable, and negotiating was half the fun. A quarter for a paperback, $1 for a lamp, 50 cents for a box of 8 tracks. The garage sale was recycling before anyone used that word. It passed possessions from one household to the next with nothing but a card table, a cash box, and a sign at the corner. Number 30. The Sunken Living Room. A close relative of the conversation pit, the sunken living room was one of the defining architectural details of the 1970s home, and in 1976 it was everywhere. The concept was simple. The main living area sat 2 or 3 steps below the adjacent rooms, separated by a railing or a low wall. Builders liked it because it added visual interest to an open floor plan without adding square footage. Homeowners liked it because it looked expensive. Real estate ads described them with enthusiasm. Guests complimented them on arrival. The problems came later. The step down caught guests who were not paying attention. Elderly relatives avoided the room entirely. Toddlers took tumbles. Moving furniture in or out required planning. Vacuuming the carpeted steps became a weekly chore that nobody enjoyed. And when tastes changed in the 1980s and 1990s, filling in a sunken living room turned out to be a renovation project that cost more than the original construction. But in 1976, none of that had happened yet. The sunken living room was still aspirational, still modern, still the part of the house tour that made visitors pause and say something admiring before they carefully stepped down. Number 29. The Metal Ice Cube Tray. Before the flexible plastic ice cube tray became the standard in American freezers, most kitchens held aluminum trays with a lever action handle mounted on top. You pulled the handle upward, and the mechanism underneath cracked the ice loose from the metal dividers with a sharp, satisfying snap. The trays froze to the shelf in the freezer compartment and sometimes required a firm tug or a splash of warm water from the tap to free them. They stuck to wet fingers in winter. Filling them at the sink required a steady hand and a tolerance for the water that always sloshed over the side on the walk back to the freezer. And the cubes came out in irregular shapes, some fully formed, some crescent-shaped, some fused together in pairs. Nobody had a better option in most kitchens, so nobody complained. In 1976, making ice was a small mechanical procedure involving metal, leverage, and a willingness to accept imperfection. Number 28. The Avon Lady. The doorbell rang, and there she was, a neighborhood woman carrying a catalog, a sample case, and a smile that suggested she had all afternoon. Avon's direct sales model had been running since the late 1800s, and by 1976 the company had hundreds of thousands of representatives selling cosmetics door-to-door in neighborhoods across the country. They demonstrated lipstick shades at kitchen tables, left perfume samples on bathroom counters, and took orders written on carbon copy forms. The catalogs came out every 2 or 3 weeks, filled with color photographs of products arranged by season. Orders were placed face-to-face and delivered the same way, usually in a small bag with a handwritten receipt. For women in rural areas or small towns without a department store or a cosmetics counter within reasonable driving distance, the Avon representative was the entire beauty industry, and she came to the front door. Number 27. The Lawn Sprinkler. On summer afternoons in 1976, oscillating lawn sprinklers ticked back and forth across front yards while children ran through the spray in bare feet, swimsuits, and cut-off shorts. The sprinkler connected to a rubber garden hose and sat on the grass, throwing a flat arc of water that swept from one side of the lawn to the other and back again in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Parents used it to keep the grass from turning brown. Children used it as a free substitute for a swimming pool. The water was cold, especially at first. The grass underneath turned to mud within the hour. The sprinkler head sometimes stuck in one position and soaked a single corner of the yard while the rest went dry. It was not an efficient irrigation tool. But in 1976, an oscillating sprinkler and a warm afternoon were all the entertainment a barefoot kid required, and nobody thought to offer anything more. Number 26. The Kitchen Wallpaper. In 1976, almost every kitchen in the country had wallpaper, and the patterns were chosen with a confidence that future homeowners would struggle to understand. Fruit baskets, roosters, teapots, and geometric shapes in avocado green, harvest gold, and burnt orange covered the walls from counter to ceiling. Some papers were textured to resemble fabric or stucco. Others were vinyl-coated for easy wiping, which was a selling point in a room where grease and steam were permanent residents. The wallpaper was chosen once and lived with for a decade or longer. Removing kitchen wallpaper when the day finally came was a weekend project that involved a steamer, a scraper, a spray bottle, and language that the children in the next room were not supposed to hear, which meant that somewhere beneath the roosters were daisies, and beneath the daisies was something from 1962 that nobody could remember choosing. Number 25. The TV Guide. Every Thursday, a small digest-sized magazine arrived in the mailbox or appeared in the rack beside the grocery store checkout, and it told you everything that would be on television for the coming week. TV Guide printed listings for every show, on every channel, in every time slot, organized by day and sorted by evening and daytime. Families circled the programs they intended to watch. Arguments about what to see on the single shared television were sometimes settled by checking the grid and sometimes not. The magazine also ran celebrity interviews, behind-the-scenes features on popular shows, and a crossword puzzle that kept adults occupied during commercials. In 1976, there was no scrolling electronic guide on the screen and no way to search for a program by name. If you wanted to know what was on tonight, you opened the TV guide. If someone in the house had lost it, misplaced it, or thrown it away before the week was over, you watched whatever appeared when you turned the dial and hoped for the best. Number 24. The savings bond. In 1976, the United States Savings Bond was the gift that every child received at some point and no child was excited about. Grandparents purchased them at the bank window in denominations of $25 or $50. The bond arrived in a stiff paper envelope with a serial number, a purchase date, and a maturity date that was often decades in the future. Kids looked at the numbers, understood that they could not spend the money now, and placed the bond in a drawer where it stayed until the drawer was cleaned out years later. The idea behind the gift was simple. By the time the child was old enough to need the money, the bond would have grown to its face value. It was a lesson in deferred gratification wrapped in government-issued paper, and in 1976, patience was still considered a virtue you taught children deliberately, not something you apologized for imposing. Number 23. The family portrait at Sears. Once a year, or whenever a new baby arrived, the family got dressed in their good clothes and drove to the portrait studio at the local Sears store. The backdrop was solid blue, gray, or a mottled brown meant to suggest nothing in particular. The photographer, who had already taken 40 similar portraits that afternoon, arranged everyone into a standard formation. Tallest in the back, shortest in the front. Baby on a parent's lap, everyone's hands visible and folded or placed on a shoulder. Someone always blinked at the wrong moment. Someone always fidgeted. The youngest child was often crying or about to cry. The proofs arrived in the mail a few weeks later in a cardboard folder, and the family chose the print where the most people looked presentable. It went into a frame on the mantel, the hallway wall, or the top of the television. Sears portrait studios were not glamorous. The lighting was flat and the poses were predictable. But they were affordable, consistent, and located inside a store the family was already visiting. And in 1976, they documented what an American family looked like in a way that a blurry snapshot from a pocket camera simply could not. Number 22. The Pledge of Allegiance. Every school day in 1976 began the same way. The teacher said, "Stand," and every student in the classroom stood, placed a hand over their heart, faced the flag in the corner of the room, and recited the Pledge of Allegiance in unison. The words were memorized by first grade and repeated every morning for the next 12 years. It was simply what happened every morning. Nobody opted out. The flag was always there, pinned or hung on a short pole mounted to the wall above the chalkboard, and the pledge was as much a part of the morning as the bell and the announcements over the intercom. It took 15 seconds. It required no thought. And for millions of kids in 1976, it was simply the way a school day started, as automatic as sitting down and opening a textbook. Number 21. The kitchen linoleum. The kitchen floor in 1976 was almost certainly linoleum, and it was almost certainly patterned. The available designs ranged from faux brick to faux ceramic tile to abstract geometric shapes in colors that were selected to match, or at least not clash with, the avocado appliances and harvest gold countertops. The linoleum was cool underfoot in summer and cold underfoot in winter. It scuffed where the chair legs dragged across it every evening and curled at the edges where it met the baseboard near the sink. Mopping it was a weekly chore that involved a bucket, a string mop, and a willingness to accept that some stains were permanent. Waxing it, for those who still bothered, was a monthly labor that made the floor shine for a few days and then returned it to its natural dull state. Replacing kitchen linoleum meant pulling up the top layer and discovering that underneath it was another layer, and underneath that was something sticky and discolored that nobody in the household wanted to identify or discuss. 1976. The kitchen floor was not a design statement. It was simply what was under your feet. Number 20. The grocery store without scanners. In 1976, The cashier at the supermarket picked up every item that crossed the belt, found the small adhesive price sticker on the can or box, read the number printed on it, and punched the price into the cash register by hand. Barcode scanners existed in a handful of test stores, but the overwhelming majority of American grocery checkouts still ran on human eyes and human fingers. Every product on the shelf had a tiny price tag applied by a store employee armed with a handheld pricing gun. The stickers fell off in the bag, they peeled halfway and left a residue. The ink faded in the freezer section. The checkout line moved at the speed of the cashier's ability to read small numbers under fluorescent light. Mistakes happened, and customers who watched the register tape carefully enough occasionally caught one. The receipt was a long white ribbon of purple ink that most people checked in the car or crumpled into the grocery bag without looking. The entire system relied on a human being reading and entering a price for every single item in the cart. And in 1976, that was simply how groceries were bought. Number 19. Muscle cars. The muscle car era was fading by 1976, choked by emissions regulations, the fuel crisis, and insurance premiums that had climbed past what most young drivers could afford. But the cars themselves were still on the road, and they were impossible to ignore. Chevrolet Camaros, Ford Mustangs, Pontiac Firebirds, Dodge Challengers, they rumbled through parking lots and idled at red lights with a sound that shook the ground. The engines were big, the paint was loud, and the back tires were wider than the fronts. By the mid-70s, new models were being detuned and downsized to meet federal standards, and the raw, unregulated horsepower of the late 60s was already becoming a memory. But in 1976, the muscle cars that were still running carried a presence that no sedan or station wagon could match. They were fast, loud, and beautiful, and every teenager who walked past one in a parking lot stopped to look. Number 18. Flash cubes. The flash cube sat on top of the camera like a small glass turret with 4 individual bulbs arranged in a square, one facing each direction. Every time you pressed the shutter, the camera fired one bulb, and the cube rotated a quarter turn to present the next fresh one. 4 flashes per cube. Then you pulled the spent cube off the top of the camera, felt the heat still radiating from the blackened glass, and snapped a new one into place. Used flash cubes accumulated in kitchen junk drawers across the country, their 4 faces darkened and spent, too interesting to throw away and too useless to keep. Kids collected them. Some people used them as decorations on a Christmas tree. In 1976, taking a photograph indoors meant a brief pop of white light, a faint chemical smell of burned filament, and the small mechanical click of the cube turning to the next position. The ritual was brief, repetitive, and part of every birthday party, holiday dinner, and family gathering. Photography in 1976 was slower than it would become, and louder, and the flash cube was the reason. Number 17. The Viking 1 Mars landing. On July 20th, 1976, a machine built by human hands touched the surface of another planet for the first time in history. Viking 1 landed on the plains of Cres Planitia on Mars after a journey of nearly a year, and within hours it sent back the first photograph ever taken from the surface of another world. The image was not dramatic by the standards of what came later. It showed a rocky, rust-colored landscape under a pale sky, scattered with small stones and stretching to a flat horizon. There were no mountains in the frame, no craters, no sign of anything alive, just a quiet, empty plain on a planet that no human had ever touched, and no human has touched since. But the photograph changed something. It proved that the machines worked, that the engineering held, and that the planet was real in a way that telescopes and equations could never fully convey. The Viking lander carried instruments designed to test the Martian soil for signs of life. The results were ambiguous and debated for decades, but the images were not. They showed a world that was recognizable, almost familiar, a desert that could have been Arizona if the sky were a different color. Viking 1 operated on the surface for over 6 years, far beyond its planned mission. It sent back tens of thousands of images. And for millions of Americans who watched the first photos appear on their television screens in the summer of 1976, the moment was simple and enormous at the same time. We had sent a machine to Mars, and Mars had sent back a picture. In the same summer that the country was celebrating 200 years of its own history, a camera on another planet reminded everyone that the future was not a concept, it was already happening. Number 16. The Church Bulletin Board. Just inside the entrance of nearly every church in America, usually in the narthex or the fellowship hall, was a corkboard covered in thumbtack notices arranged in no particular order. Bake sale this Saturday. Youth group meets Wednesday at 7. Someone in the congregation needed a ride to the hospital on Tuesday morning. A family had a used refrigerator to give away. In 1976, the Church Bulletin Board served as one of the most effective neighborhood information networks in the country. Birth announcements, prayer requests, potluck sign-up sheets, volunteer calls, babysitting offers, and thank you notes to the Altar Guild all shared space on the same rectangle of cork beneath the same fluorescent light. People read it on their way in and again on their way out. The information was never current for more than a week. Notices curled at the edges and yellowed under the tacks. But the board reached everyone who walked through the front door, and in 1976, that was most of the neighborhood. Number 15. The Penny Saver. The Penny Saver was a thin newsprint weekly delivered free to every mailbox in the local area, and its pages were packed tight with small classified advertisements that covered everything a community needed to buy, sell, or trade. People listed used lawnmowers, offered piano lessons, advertised babysitting services, rented apartments, and sold kittens. The ads were short, sometimes misspelled, and charged by the word, which encouraged a telegram-style brevity that made browsing them an exercise in interpretation. Readers circled promising listings with a ballpoint pen and then walked to the kitchen phone to call the number. In 1976, if you needed to sell something you owned, find something you needed, or hire someone for a job, the Penny Saver was faster than a church bulletin board and considerably cheaper than a display ad in the daily paper. It arrived smelling of fresh newsprint on Tuesday and was in the recycling or the trash by Thursday. Number 14. The Thank You Note. In 1976, a gift received without a written thank you note in return was considered a minor social failure, and in some families a serious one. Children were expected to sit at the kitchen table with a pen and a box of stationery and write a note to every aunt, uncle, grandparent, and family friend who had sent a birthday present, a Christmas gift, or a graduation card with a check inside. The notes were short, the handwriting was uneven, the sentiment was often identical from one card to the next, since the child was producing a dozen of them in a row, and the creativity ran out after the third envelope. But the act of writing them was non-negotiable in most households. Parents stood over the table, refused dessert or television privileges, and waited until the last envelope was addressed and sealed. The thank you note was not really about expressing gratitude. It was about demonstrating manners. And in 1976, manners were enforced with the same seriousness as homework and bedtime. Number 13. The Savings Passbook. The Savings Passbook was a small booklet, roughly the size of a checkbook, that the bank issued when you opened a savings account. Every time you made a deposit or a withdrawal, the teller took the passbook, inserted it into a small machine behind the counter, and the machine printed the date, the transaction amount, and the new balance in a neat row of numbers on the next available line. Children who had savings accounts brought their passbooks to the bank on Saturdays with birthday money or coins saved in a jar and watched the printed balance grow by $5 or $10 at a time. The passbook made money feel physical, tangible, and real. You could hold it in your hand, flip through the pages, and see every single deposit traced back to the day the account was opened. In 1976, before ATM screens and online banking existed, saving money was something you watched happen in ink on paper, one printed line at a time. Number 12. The neighborhood babysitter. She was usually a teenager from a few houses down, and she arrived on a Friday or Saturday night with a school bag and a willingness to stay up past midnight. The babysitter in 1976 was not certified, not background checked, and not trained in first aid. She was available, she lived nearby, and the parents trusted her enough to leave the house. The instructions were brief. Bedtime is 9, there are snacks in the kitchen, and the emergency number is on the wall by the phone. The babysitter watched television, talked on the phone, raided the pantry, and kept the kids alive until the parents came home, which was the entire job description. She was paid in cash at the end of the night, and the amount was based on the number of hours and the generosity of the parents, not a posted rate. The neighborhood babysitter was part of a system that ran on proximity, familiarity, and the assumption that a 14-year-old was old enough to be in charge. Number 11. The storm door. Nearly every house in America in 1976 had a storm door, a second door mounted on the outside of the main entry that served a different purpose depending on the season. In winter, a glass panel slid into the frame to block drafts and keep the cold on the porch. In summer, the glass panel came out and a screen panel went in, letting air through while keeping the flies and mosquitoes on the other side. The aluminum frame rattled when the wind hit it from the side. The pneumatic closer mounted at the top hissed and sometimes failed entirely, allowing the door to slam shut with enough force to shake the frame and startle everyone in the front room. Children pushed through it a dozen times a day without slowing down. The latch rarely lined up properly with the strike plate after a few years of use. Replacing the screen after someone put a knee through it during a hurried exit became one of the minor recurring projects of summer. The storm door was not an attractive addition to the front of a house, but it kept the insects out in July and the draft out in January. And in 1976, that was the only job description it needed. Number 10. Family board games. On a weeknight or a rainy Saturday afternoon in 1976, the family gathered around the kitchen table or the living room floor and played a board game. Monopoly lasted for hours and ended in accusations. Risk lasted even longer and ended in silence. Sorry was quick and vicious. Life came with tiny plastic cars and pink and blue pegs that represented your family, and the spinner clicked loud enough to hear from the next room. Scrabble brought out the dictionary and the arguments over whether a word was real. Clue required note-taking and suspicion. The games were stored in closets with lids that never fit properly and pieces that gradually went missing over the years. Board games were not a backup plan. They were entertainment, and they required everyone in the house to sit in the same room, follow the same rules, and pay attention to each other for an hour or two, which in 1976 was still something families did without being told. Number 9. Walter Cronkite and the Evening News. At 6:30 every weeknight, millions of American families turned on CBS and watched Walter Cronkite deliver the news. His sign-off, and that's the way it is, followed by the date, was the most trusted closing line on television. Cronkite had covered the Kennedy assassination, the moon landing, and the Vietnam War, and by 1976 he had become something more than a journalist. He was a fixture, a constant in a decade that had been anything but constant. Families trusted him because he was calm, because he was consistent, and because he never seemed to be selling anything. The evening news was a 30-minute ritual that the whole house observed. The television was turned to CBS. Dinner waited or continued quietly. And when Cronkite said his line and the broadcast ended, the family had a shared understanding of what had happened in the world that day. That shared understanding, delivered by a single voice to an entire nation at the same time, was something that 1976 took for granted and that no era since has managed to replicate. Number 8. Handwritten letters. In 1976, staying in touch with someone who lived more than a few miles away meant writing a letter. Not a text, not an email. A letter, written by hand on lined paper or stationery, folded into an envelope, addressed in ink, stamped and dropped into a mailbox. The response took days, sometimes a week, and the wait was part of the experience. Grandmothers wrote to grandchildren. Soldiers wrote home. Teenagers at summer camp wrote to friends and crushes with a care and formality that no text message has ever approached. The handwriting was the signature. You could recognize who a letter was from before opening it, just by the shape of the words on the envelope. Letters were saved in shoe boxes and dresser drawers. They were reread on quiet evenings. They carried weight that no digital message has ever matched because they took time, they took effort, and they could be held. Number 7. The Harvest Gold Refrigerator. By 1976, the American kitchen color palette had settled into 3 dominant shades: avocado green, copper-tone brown, and harvest gold. Of the 3, harvest gold was the warm option, a deep yellow tan that appeared on refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and even countertop appliances in matching sets. The refrigerator, more than any other appliance, declared which color camp the household had pledged allegiance to, and harvest gold was the most popular choice that year. The refrigerator itself was large, loud, and heavy enough to require 2 adults and a furniture dolly to move. It had a freezer compartment at the top with a door that required a firm pull and a handle that came loose every few months. The shelves inside were wire grids that left grid marks on the bottom of everything placed on them. The crisper drawers at the bottom held lettuce that wilted after 3 days and fruit that bruised on contact. The door racks held ketchup, mustard, a bottle of Worcestershire sauce that had been there since before the youngest child was born, and a jar of pickle relish that no one could remember purchasing. The outside surface of the door was a gallery. Report cards, grocery coupons, emergency telephone numbers, a calendar from the insurance agent, a photo from last summer's vacation, and a crayon drawing that had earned a spot of honor, all held in place by magnets shaped like fruit, state outlines, or the logo of a local business. The Harvest Gold refrigerator was not merely an appliance. It was the family's filing cabinet, message board, and trophy wall. It hummed through the night, clicked on and off in a rhythm the household learned to sleep through, and anchored the kitchen for a decade or more before someone decided that white or almond was the more sensible modern choice. In 1976, nobody called Harvest Gold dated. It was simply the color of the kitchen, and the kitchen was the center of the house. Number 6. The American Flag. In the summer of 1976, the American flag was everywhere. Porches flew them. Car antennas carried small versions that flapped in the wind. Children wore them on t-shirts. Businesses painted them on storefronts. The bicentennial turned flag display into a national reflex. But even outside the celebration, the flag held a place in daily life that was simpler and less contested than it would become in later decades. It hung in every classroom. It flew at every post office, every courthouse, and every school. The colors had not yet become a political signal. In 1976, the flag was just the flag, a piece of fabric that meant the country, not a faction within it. And it flew over a nation that was bruised, divided, and a little tired, but still willing to put it up every morning and take it down every night. Number 5. The Neighborhood Watch Sign. On telephone poles and street corner posts across the country, small rectangular metal signs displayed the silhouette of a watchful eye and the words Neighborhood Watch or We Watch Out for Each Other. The program, promoted by local police departments, encouraged residents to keep an eye on their blocks and report suspicious activity. In 1976, most neighborhoods were already running their own informal version of this arrangement without a sign or a meeting. Adults knew every child on the street by first name. A kid acting up 3 houses down could expect the news to reach his mother before he did. Strangers walking through the block at unusual hours were noticed from behind kitchen curtains and discussed over the back fence the next morning. The official neighborhood watch sign made the system visible, but the system itself had been operating for years on nothing more than proximity, repetition, and a willingness to pick up the telephone. Number 4. The hand-cranked ice cream maker. On summer afternoons and holiday weekends, someone in the family hauled the wooden bucket out of the garage, set it on the porch or the back patio, and packed it tight with ice and rock salt. The custard went into the metal canister in the center, the lid went on, and then the cranking began. The handle turned easily at first, but as the cream thickened inside the canister, the resistance grew until the person cranking was using both hands and leaning into it. Kids took turns until their arms gave out after a few minutes. Then a parent or an uncle took over and finished the job with slow, grinding rotations. The ice cream that came out of the canister was softer than anything from the store and tasted different in a way that nobody could precisely describe, but everyone in the yard immediately recognized. Vanilla was the standard. Peach was the summer favorite. Chocolate required more sugar than anyone wanted to measure. The hand-cranked ice cream maker was not convenient. It was slow, messy, and demanded physical effort from everyone in the household who was old enough to grip the handle. In 1976, that was exactly the point. Number 3, the sound of the screen door. Every house in 1976 had a screen door, and every screen door made the same sound. A creak as it opened, a brief pause at the top of its arc, and then a sharp wooden bang as the spring pulled it shut. That sound was the punctuation mark of a childhood summer. It meant someone was leaving. It meant someone was coming in. It meant the dog had gotten out. It meant dinner was ready. The screen door was the barrier between inside and outside, and in 1976 it was crossed dozens of times a day. The mesh kept the bugs out and let the breeze in, and on a warm evening with every window open, the whole house breathed through those screens. The hinges were never oiled, the spring was never adjusted, and the bang of that door closing behind a kid running into the yard was one of the defining sounds of a decade when the boundary between indoors and outdoors was nothing more than a thin wire mesh and a wooden frame. Number 2, the bicentennial baby. Hospitals across the country held quiet, unofficial competitions on July 4, 1976, to see which newborn would be the first baby delivered on the nation's 200th birthday. Nurses checked the clock. Families crossed their fingers. Local newspapers and television stations sent reporters to the maternity ward hoping for a photograph and a quote from a proud parent who had just delivered a child on the most celebrated date in a generation. The announcements ran in papers across the country, each town claiming its own first bicentennial baby with a headline and a photo of a blanket-wrapped infant who had no idea what all the fuss was about. Some of those children grew up always knowing they shared a birthday with the biggest party the country had ever thrown. Others learned about the coincidence later and shrugged. The bicentennial baby was not a planned phenomenon. It was what happened when an entire nation spent a year building toward a single date on the calendar, and life as it does arrived on its own schedule regardless. Number 1, the feeling that it would last forever. Nobody in 1976 thought the world they were living in was temporary. The rotary phone was just the phone. The station wagon was just the car. The milkman, the lunch counter, the clothesline, the screen door, the front porch, the sound of a neighborhood alive with kids and lawnmowers and ice cream trucks. None of it felt like it was going anywhere. That was the thing about 1976. It did not feel like a moment. It felt like the way things were. The idea that all of it would one day be replaced, miniaturized, digitized, or simply abandoned was not something anyone spent time considering. The world moved at a pace that allowed you to notice it. Dinner lasted an hour. A letter took a week. A photograph took a week longer. And the people in your life were the ones you could see from your front yard. In 1976, the present tense was sturdy enough to stand on, and nobody was in a hurry to leave it behind. The year did not announce itself as historic. Most people who lived through 1976 would have called it ordinary. A quarter with a drummer on the back, a speed limit everyone complained about, a television set that took 30 seconds to warm up. These were background details, not headlines, but decades have a way of sharpening. The things you barely noticed at the time become the things you cannot stop thinking about later. The weight of a rotary phone, the sound of a screen door on a summer evening, the particular silence of a house where every light was off except the one in the kitchen. If any of that stirred something, put it in the comments. The smallest details are usually the ones that last. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good time. More of these are on the way. Thank you for watching. That is 100 pieces of 1976, and not one of them required a password, a subscription, or a screen in your pocket. The whole year happened in plain daylight, on front lawns and kitchen floors and the seats of station wagons with the windows rolled down. If something on this list put you back in a room you had forgotten about, say so in the comments. The details people remember are never the ones the history books keep. If you enjoyed this, hit subscribe. More of these are coming. Thank you for watching.